Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to my channel, Analyze This Mr. Bond, where I discuss the adventures of James Bond 007 and dig for what lies beneath the surface. And today we're digging into the question of generational changeover. Bond 26 lurks on the horizon, and our next James Bond is almost certainly to be a millennial. It is very likely that the next actor to take up the Bond mantle will have been born in the late 80s or early 90s. And that means he's constitutionally different than the Bonds that have come before, especially if this new Bond film is set in the present day, as most of us expect it will be. But regardless of the nature of the character himself, his audience is primarily going to be Generation Z, Generation Alpha. The millennials had their Bonds. They had Pierce Brosnan, they had Daniel Craig. Now the time is to establish a new Bond for a new generation. And of course, Bond is for everyone, but it's this new generation that's going to keep the idea of Bond alive. And of course, the Bond character has made such transitions before. That's what GoldenEye was in the 90s and Casino Royale was in 2006. But now the character has to establish itself for a new generation after what will almost have been a decade of absence by the time the character reappears, let's say late 2027, at the earliest, more likely in 2028. That's a long time for the character to have been off screen. And Generation Z, Gen Alpha, these aren't nostalgic generations. They're not yearning for Bond to return to the screen. The world James Bond was forged in was the Cold War. The Cold War being the period that emerged in the wake of the chaos of World War II as new binaries were formed. You had the West versus the East. You had democracy versus communism, and James Bond exists in the center of that. He was the protector of Western interests. In many ways, he was the West's shadow self, the individual sent into the difficult spaces to do the dirty work, the disreputable side of protecting Western interests and saving the world from bad actors. Gen Z and Gen Alpha do not live in a world that's as clean-cut as that. Globalization, which has been in effect for a long time, and the Bond series has continued to reckon with that globalization, is now at a great extreme, as social media has in many ways softened cultural boundaries, made them less hard to detect. They're less set by national lines. Culture is very virtual, it's very overlapping, it's very algorithmic. And if you look at the studies, Gen Z are marked by things like institutional distrust, economic anxiety. They went through the COVID pandemic, and that seeped deeply into their bones. They've seen media overload and identity fragmentation as a result. They're very sensitive to this idea of performative identity, this pressure to have a performative identity that is separate from your true identity, and this concern about what authenticity looks like in those spaces. They don't instinctually trust systems. They mock them. There's a kind of sarcastic doomer humor that has cropped up in Gen Z and Gen Alpha. There's a sarcasm. Some of us may recall the cynicism of Gen X as they came into their own. There's a similar flavor here, but there's a bit more of a cynical complacency about Gen Z and Gen Alpha, a sort of cynicism about the structures that are in place and a sense of having to navigate those. There's actually some interesting synchronicity there for the Bond character, because the Bond character has always been a character that inhabits liminal spaces, spaces where identity is fluid, spaces where the political boundaries of nations have started to break down. Bond is sent into these gray areas. And in some ways, Bond being a character that brings some sense of order to chaos, or at least cuts through with his own sense of individual purpose, is some way to position the character in a way that speaks to where Gen Z and Gen Alpha are at, and more broadly speaking, where the world around us is at. In many ways, Bond was a fantasy of control when he first emerged. Ian Fleming introduced Bond as a hero that reflected the fading of the British Empire. The Bond novels in particular are very concerned with Britain's place in the world and the global order, and the way that evolves over the time period in which the Bond books are set. The movies took that fantasy and made it even sharper, a little bit more fantastical. Bond became much more of an international figure once he achieved super popularity through Sean Connery and Roger Moore. He became a global icon, and he still stood for British identity, but he became overall a defender of broader Western interests. He was broadly celebrated by Western leaders despite having a uniquely British identity. And what he embodied was essentially an uninhibited personal freedom. He was a version of masculinity that had been taken off the leash. All of the voracious appetites that were repressed in 1960s culture ran wild in Sean Connery's Bond, and by the time you got to Roger Moore's Bond, he became an affectionate caricature of what masculinity looked like when it was unleashed. In many ways, Roger Moore's Bond didn't have the teeth that Connery's Bond did. It was kind of an affectionate relic, a reminder of a previous era as the 1970s and 1980s moved beyond those impulses. Pierce Brosnan was able to more firmly ground the character in a new era in the 90s, and you have his Bond be the first one to really tacitly acknowledge the extent to which the character is out of step with the times. Daniel Craig's Bond brought Bond right into the era of the War on Terror with a vengeance. Casino Royale was a shot in the arm for the series that took inspiration from heroes like Jason Bourne and Jack Bauer, but also returned back to the Fleming character and created a hot-headed, much more unstable version of the character situated in a world of institutional distrust. The political orders that now supported Bond and sent him out on his mission were subject to distrust. They're corrupt. They're guilty of past sins that now come to haunt them in the present moment. Bond is in conflict in many ways with the political institutions that employ him. You see this level of complexity start to build, and that reflects in the personal trauma of Bond's character. In many ways, trauma becomes the defining feature of Daniel Craig's Bond. That's why he's the only Bond to die. In many ways, that sort of moment was an acknowledgement of this character existing in a perpetual state of both inner and outer turmoil. He couldn't reconcile himself to himself or to the world around him, and the only way to end his story was to blow him off the map. Gen Z lives in the same world that Daniel Craig's Bond left behind when he was taken out by a missile. But they don't really need a mirror for its own dysfunction. They're kind of used to it. They know it. They have intuitively grasped what they're in. They're already facing anxieties about their political and economic future. Everything feels very uncertain, and in many ways, they're just looking for a way to cut through the mess. In such a cultural moment as that, a hero who acts with purpose and cuts through the noise and doesn't unravel is perhaps more useful or appealing or compelling than a character whose arc is just progressive deconstruction. I would argue that Gen Z and Gen Alpha are pragmatic generations. The studies certainly show that. And a pragmatic hero who's working in the gray area of the world to find his own sense of purpose, I think that's a potentially more resonant way to focus the Bond character. We all know that Bond is fundamentally an anti-hero. He is, as I've said before, kind of the shadow self of the West. He is a dark character who's sent in to do the dirty work of governments. The movies have always kind of struggled to navigate that tension between that character's essence as a darker character, but also an instinctually heroic character who is tasked with restoring balance to the global order. As much as I can paint Bond as an emblem of Western democracy and order, he's actually always been kind of an impish figure. Connery's Bond was always seen as a bit of a rebellious figure by the establishment. The Catholic Church condemned the Connery Bond films for their brazen immorality. This was a character who thumbed his nose at social conventions. He was raw, unabashed, bracingly himself, dispensing with conventional logic about what a hero should be and how a man should present himself in polite society. Moore carried that forward. It was just a more mocking and playful and tongue-in-cheek representation of the same concept. If you look at the ending of The Spy Who Loved Me, where he's keeping the British end up, all the authority figures look on in horror as Bond kind of does his thing, so to speak. He's thumbing his nose at polite society, at the institutional order. And that same instinct carries over even into things like the Daniel Craig era, where he's essentially a rogue agent for the bulk of his career. He is at odds with the order, even as he seeks to right wrongs and defeat the evil forces in the world. If you actually look at the studies, and I've done some research before this, Gen Z is pretty comfortable with moral ambiguity and gray areas in their storytelling. In fact, a recent study showed that they actually prefer morally gray characters to characters that are a little bit more binary and black and white. There's a kind of inbuilt pessimism about systems for Gen Z and Gen Alpha. They expect them to fail. They want characters who are able to navigate the complexities of those compromised situations. And that sounds a lot like a spy working in liminal spaces who has to adopt different identities depending on the situation, who has to navigate a world plagued by uncertainty. Pitching Bond as that kind of gray area anti-hero actually makes a lot of sense, especially if you pair him with a personal sense of clarity, where he's capable of navigating a world in disarray. After all, Gen Z lives in a state of contradiction. They have to perform, but they also value authenticity. So this balance between manicuring a vision of yourself, a personal brand, and also being authentic is intrinsic to their sense of what it's like to live in a world where social media is dominant. They understand what it's like to have a curated self and an authentic self, and to try to navigate the tension between those identities. So that sounds like a perfect element to bring forward in the spy work of James Bond. If anything, the Daniel Craig era moved away from this sense of Bond having cover stories and false identities, but that's something that's much stronger in the formative stories for Bond, the Fleming novels in particular, where Bond is putting him in situations where he's putting on a false front, where he's navigating relationships with other characters under pretense. That sounds like a really fertile ground that can speak to a moment where identity as a curated object is well understood. And in fact, Bond's sense of self-possession maps nicely onto the Gen Z obsession with authenticity. If you look at some of Gen Z's favorite celebrities and the sort of energy that's out there in the zeitgeist right now, it's about this sort of relaxed self-possession. Even fashion has become less uptight. Everything's looser, more drapey. The celebrities that are being focused on are people who just seem very effortlessly self-possessed. They're not overly polished, overly manicured. Shifting away from Bond as a sort of polished performative persona to a character who's just effortlessly relaxed in being who he is. A sense of comfort with the life that he's chosen for himself, a sense of self-understanding about what he's seeking from life in his hedonistic pursuits. It feels like there's some good alignment between that type of characterization and where Gen Z and potentially Gen Alpha, as they mature, are going. A character who navigates a world of complexities and contradictions with an assured sense of purpose and identity. Well, that sounds a lot like the classic archetype of James Bond. So in many ways, maybe this is a return to basics. In many ways, what might resonate with Gen Z and Gen Alpha is a return to some of the characteristics that defined the character when he became such a success to begin with. This sort of self-possession, this lack of pretense, this clarity about desire and intention, and this ability to navigate the gray area with confidence and purpose. Well, maybe that's what our future James Bond needs. In a chaotic, curated, collapsing world, someone who moves with clarity and acts without apology can anchor fantasy again. So let me know what you think about this proposal. Let me know what you're thinking that James Bond might need to be in order to continue to resonate in our current climate and with future generations. Do you think I'm on the right track, or do you think I'm headed in the wrong direction? It's up for debate, but as always, I call it like I see it, and I look forward to discussing with you in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.